yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. The planet's puppet masters almost surely have a plan. There's clearly maybe something there beyond the realm of man. And until we've thoroughly tested every last close-chested view, I find the more we think we know, the less we really do. Where would we be without THC? Cause we know they're lying to us, just don't know to what degree. Where would we be without THC? The Higherside Chats show, Greg Carlwood and company.
Brace yourselves, Higherside Chatters. From the Sunshine State, I'm Greg Carlwood, and we're well past the understanding that you could ever have an honest or complete picture of the true geopolitical puppet string pullers and their unadvertised agendas through the lenses of mainstream corporate news. But what do we do in a culture of digital and seemingly decentralized media landscapes where new brands are spun up with old money, well-placed guests on popular podcasts are used to steer perception, and many popular commentators and emerging figures work hard to hide their funding and backgrounds? Some might even call this the era of Mockingbird Media 2.0, but it's no doubt more confusing than ever to find the signal in a bunch of noise, which is a massive problem when things are moving as fast as they are, from Doge cuts and trade tariffs to stablecoin legislation and AI infrastructure deals. I think it's safe to say that a lot of us are used to a much slower pace, and despite how optimistic some folks want to be, flooding the zone is a good way to hide what looks like an infrastructure overhaul that puts us much closer to the centralized and constantly surveilled digital control tech bro tyranny that we've been so concerned about. We need good sense makers for such a situation, and by God, would you believe it, we got them today. You might remember Jeremy Roth-Kushel from an interview we did back in 2019 that went deep into the origins of Zionist movements, the creation of Israel, Robert Maxwell and the Promise software scandal, Epstein, Trump, the Clinton Foundation, and Israeli intelligence's massive advantage in the tech sector, and their infiltration of the U.S. critical infrastructure coming out of the Talpiot program. Well, today he returns alongside with his co-host on their podcast, The Antidote, Greg McCarran. Together, they provide a 1-2 punch of truth and suss out the secret relationships of the international elite class you didn't even know were there. You can find their work at exposetheenemy.com and under The Antidote on Patreon. We're going hard today, guys. The special relationship revealers, deep politics parsers, and anti-uppers extraordinaire, Jeremy and Greg and Jeremy, welcome to the Higher Side. How the hell are you, fellas?
Doing really well. Thank you for having us on. Again, Greg. Appreciate it.
Same here, and very appreciated.
Yeah, this is going to be great. There's so many ways we could start. So much has changed since 2019, but Jeremy, you were way ahead of the game even then, pointing out the Robert Maxwell stuff, showing the deep ties between the Clintons and Epstein and Trump. It's not an either-or situation, guys. It seems like they're all dirty. We talked about the Israeli Defense Force intelligence operation to co-opt critical infrastructure by giving out their software to other countries and placing their engineers in key positions internationally. And of course, COVID was a huge level jump in digital infrastructure and smart tracking, and some people are actually starting to become more aware of this stuff since the October 7th event and its aftermath, wondering why every politician is in lockstep with Israel, wondering why we need to involve ourselves at all, asking simple questions like, why are all the VPN companies that sponsor podcasts from Israel? Or why does it look like the Israeli Defense Force created Hamas as an opposition like the U.S. seemed to have created their own opposition groups in the Middle East? These are curious things, guys. It does seem like we're full on in a tech bro administration, and it's nice to see some people questioning things, but they still can be confusing. Given the content of our last conversation, Jeremy, where are you now with this stuff? What threads have you been researching the last couple of years?
Well, I was thinking back on our first conversation and how it was the calm before this massive storm. And I think we spoke in maybe the first month of 2019. And later that year, Jeffrey Epstein would be arrested for the second time, end up in jail, awaiting trial, apparently suicide, whatever. We still don't exactly know. And then Ghislaine Maxwell was sort of somehow on the run in the United States, but actually living in a mansion up in New Hampshire. And she then gets arrested and tried, and she's now in prison. And then, of course, COVID was just coming in to effect in the end of 2019 into the beginning of 2020. And then Greg and I did a response to what was called the alleged response to COVID, where we talked about a new 3/11, because 3/11, March 11th, was the date that the international response was declared to COVID. And so usually what we seem to see is something very similar to what you described. Whenever someone's asking you to choose one side of a dialectic, COVID as the most dangerous thing, or do you choose the COVID vaccine as the most dangerous thing? Anytime you're getting stuck in these kinds of choices, you're almost always being brutalized, attempted to be brutalized by a weaponized dialectic. And so Greg and I have basically continued to evolve a deconstruction and an analysis of what we might call deep geopolitics that really works to make coherent, as you pointed out. Sense making is really crucial right now as we are bombarded with massive organized chaos, informational clamor, always at our fingertips. And so we're working to deconstruct weaponized dialectics and maybe to up the geometry of our logics in a certain way, at least add a third, maybe. You know, the people say that if you want to figure out how to make people fight or how to divide someone within themselves, then create two sides. If you want to create a geometrical, let's say a logical object that has more potential stability, at least just add a third option to some extent. And so I would just finish up by saying it's everything almost always is both, and neither nor
Yes.
in terms of your options.
I love that. That is a great way to set things up because, of course, everyone listening has their own kind of predetermined positioning on all sorts of things, and some of it will be disrupted. But to say out in front, like, hey, we think it's all bad, you know, there's no worse and less worse, and it's just one big club and we aren't in it. So Greg, let me bring you in here to maybe add to what Jeremy said and talk to us a little bit about maybe some of the relationships and agendas that you see that help make sense of what's going on with like the current administration and the things so far this year, where everyone seems to have a lot of opinions and questions about, but not a ton of clarity.
Yeah, and I was telling you, Greg, before we came on, it feels like a different, almost like an alternate, like a different, like we've just gone through like a whole lifespan since 2019. I mean, things are so, you've had the woke wars and the COVID wars, and it feels like, say what Jeremy had said. Yeah, there's a lot of already in place as far as conflicts and disagreements within our population, as far as divisive matters that have just really, I think, ever since, I would say, 2020 and the end of the first Trump term going on into Trump 2.0 have really been exacerbated to just a different level than we've seen before. So what we try to do, and I think what Jeremy said there, neither nor, is very important, because sometimes with our critiques, geopolitics and of the state of things, as far as like some of the things we get into, like as far as maybe countries like Russia and Israel go, it can be, oh, well, you're just on like the American side or whatever. But like, we do make a point to try to be neither nor. Like we do not want to go back to the days of like we do not want to go back to the unipolar moment, as it's called, with like everything that comes with that, or the or maybe the state of geopolitics before, like, before MAGA and Trump and all this. But, it's also to say that there are ways to look at these other than just like, just a, say, a complete rejecting of anything that's seen as. So I think it's important to look further than just in the lens of, you have to take sides, like between like between business as usual, U.S. politics, domestic, geopolitical, but then also just like a complete embracing of like this complete turning upside down aspects of the American state, the American experiment, as we call it, that we get deeper into like in our own private conversations, in addition to what we've been covering on our show. So I think neither nor is a very important principle, because sometimes it can be easy to say, well, you're just like, you're in this camp or this camp or that camp. And also things that we are talking about are certainly not really very much covered by other people that might fall into what would be called alternative conspiracy culture media. So we really do try to, in our way, fill our unique void. And anybody who says they have all the answers is lying to you. But at the very least, we have unique things we bring to the table, to say the least, I think.
Yes, for sure. And in terms of the relationships that are kind of unadvertised, one of the big ones that you kind of mentioned there is the Russia-Israel relationship. And a big part of your work that I've been digesting this week is that you kind of say Russiagate was definitely not nothing. It's not a hoax, but it actually is a very cozy relationship between New York, Tel Aviv, and Moscow. It's not a question of, is Trump a Russian asset or an Israeli one? It seems like a little bit of unknown history is that Israel kind of did a Project Paperclip type of thing when the Soviet Union fell and brought in large amounts of Russian Jews to bolster up its militarized tech. And a lot of what we're seeing now makes a lot more sense when this less obvious love triangle is fleshed out. Is that fair to say?
Yes. And one we work to do at The Antidote is destigmatize and recontextualize deep politics. So what we call Trump Russia or the Russia collusion hoax, we called it 11/9 because that was the date that Trump was announced to be the elected president in 2016. And then we saw Michael Moore, whose agent in Hollywood, Ari Emanuel, the son of an Irgun Zionist terrorist, his brother being Rahm Emanuel, Obama's first chief of staff. And so we picked up on this thread that there was deep politics here because Michael Moore had actually done a film called Fahrenheit 9/11 and then made Fahrenheit 11/9. And the first film actually limited the hangout about another very obvious deep operation, 9/11, September 11th, which really launches the so-called new American century, which is really, if you listen to someone like Alexander Dugin, as we head into this question of Russia and Israel, Alexander Dugin is sometimes, controversialized or cartoonified as Putin's brain or as some kind of wacky philosopher, but he actually looks to be some kind of global strategic deception Russian military intelligence officer of some sort. It's called Maskirovka, which is long-term, from the Soviet sphere, strategic deception planning. And Alexander Dugin, for example, at a New Horizons conference that I was actually invited to, maybe around the time that we first talked, Greg, he talked about how September 11th, 9/11, represented the moment of the rise of a multipolar world order, which is now being talked about as a multipolar new world order, actually. Soon after Trump was, quote unquote, reelected this last time, you heard Putin at Valdai talking about a new world order. You saw Elon Musk on Twitter X talking about a new world order right in that time. And Dugin at this New Horizon conference also talked about how September 11th represented the moment where there was a reversal of decline of the Russian sphere. So just to finish up, yes, what we call the 11/9 operation was very Trump Russia. It goes decades back. The question that you pose, is Trump a Russian asset? Is Trump an Israeli asset? Yes, he's all of that and more. And what we begin to talk about is how Trump is now getting to a point where he is dealing with the difficulty of being a multi-decade, maybe multi-generational compromise asset shared amongst different spheres of interest. Some of them are domestic that include exactly what we were talking about, the tech bro monarchist types, the North American technate types, the Peter Thiel, through all of the Silicon Valley bros who are now totally inside of this administration and all of that, but very Russian also. Trump was cultivated as a Russian asset since probably the late 70s. From around the time of his first marriage to Ivana Trump. And then through the 80s is when then the underside of the Russian deep state. And remember, these kinds of terms have been weaponized, but they have actual coherent meanings. Deep state means on the top, you have the national security operations, especially the covert arms of intelligence, usually. And on the bottom, you then have what we call black economy, mob economy, sometimes oligarchs. And we see that even in the American context, such as like the super mob, Gus Russo's book about how the Jewish mobsters went legit and ultimately became the now sort of current oligarchs who have their names on institutions across the United States, including at the highest levels of the academy and hospitals, people like Les Wexner and the rest of the mega group and all those types. But in finishing up in terms of Russia, Israel, the other event that we, did not talk about in terms of since we last spoke about was obviously October 7th. And then what we've seen in this escalating and seemingly endlessly constructed war of terror on Gaza with obvious genocidal intent behind it, at least in terms of attempting to destroy the coherence and possibility of the Palestinian nation and the Palestinian people, at least in part, including an ethnic cleansing operation. And so a lot of people don't usually point out, October 7th was a present. It was a gift of some sort. It was obviously a gift to Benjamin Netanyahu and his Israeli regime, because as he told Douglas Murray, I've always wanted to do exactly what we're doing in Gaza, but I couldn't have gotten my own people behind me, let alone the rest of the world, if not for Hamas did on October 7th, which he then, Netanyahu told Dr. Phil, he said was incredible, was the phrase that he actually used. But the other person that October 7th was a gift to, literally, was Vladimir Putin, because October 7th was his birthday. And so we can discuss the relationship of Putin and Netanyahu, the relationship of the deep geopolitics, the weaponized dialectics of Israel-Palestine, Netanyahu's regime, Hamas, Putin, Netanyahu. But this is very much an orchestrated and long-term dialectic that goes even way back before the massive influence of Jewish Russian immigrants into Israel around the beginning of the so-called fall of the Soviet Union, but actually maybe goes back to before the beginning of the Israeli state.
Oh, yeah, it is a tangled web, and I know you've done lengthy series on all of these things. So if you were talking to someone who said, well, look, man, you speak well, but I just don't see this relationship between Russia and Israel. I don't see this relationship between Netanyahu and Putin and Trump. Where is it? You say it goes back a long time, maybe with Trump to the 70s. And that is something you brought up last time that I thought was really great, is talking about how Epstein, obviously seemingly an Israeli asset, Epstein and Trump were actually battling it out, trying to one-up each other a lot in the New York scene, in the real estate scene. And now, 5 years later, there's this talk that, well, the big falling out was he was taking girls, employees out of Mar-a-Lago, and there was some real estate deal. I've been hearing about this where Epstein maybe told Trump about an available property, and Trump just kind of swooped in there and took it, and that was a big issue. But I understand Russian oligarchs are involved in that as well. So I guess, yeah, just to summarize, tell us more about this relationship. What are some of the big things you would hit if you didn't have a whole lot of time, but you were trying to convince someone, hey, you need to look more into this, even though it's unadvertised?
Well, just in closing the loop on this important point that you just brought up in terms of Trump Epstein, it's said to have broken down because Trump is some kind of moral whistleblower of some sort and found out what Epstein was doing and decided to go call him to account with the local authorities, rather than having been probably at that point already a decade and a half one of Epstein's closest partners, especially in the New York, Manhattan sphere, which is where the allegations from the early 90s, 1994, I believe, by the pseudonymous Katie Johnson came out during 2016, during the escalation of the 2016 campaign, where she, I believe, under oath, credibly accused Trump and Epstein of raping her when she was a 13-year-old girl. She doesn't allege this happened on the island or on the Lolita Express or down in Florida, but at the Les Wexner supplied Epstein brownstone in Manhattan, which now the next door brownstone is I believe, still owned by Howard Lutnick, who is
Oh.
at the highest levels of the Trump, I'll call it a regime. But this very specific moment that you talk about, and then I'll pass it over to Greg in terms of the actual history of the breakdown of the relationship between Trump and Epstein, did happen largely because, as Trump now said, he stole one of my employees, Virginia Giuffre, in that case. And just so not that it was a problem of what Epstein was actually doing or any of that, but just that that Epstein stole Trump's worker or something like that. What kind of worker? That's another question. But even behind that is this question of this real estate down in Florida, a key property right on the coast. It was formerly actually owned by Les Wexner, Abe Gossman, I think, and Trump really wanted this. Trump was in a difficult state, actually, in terms of his finances, and so he elbowed Epstein out. And I don't know the background of like whether, you know, he was told by Epstein about this property and that's what made it personal, or Epstein felt like he was undermined by Trump, but it does look like Trump threw Epstein under the bus in order to gain access to this property at a very good price. And now it's just very recently come out that there are allegations that this Russian sphere oligarch who ultimately purchases the property from Trump, more than doubling his money at a crucial moment, Bribolovlev, who's a fertilizer oligarch who works in the Russian and Ukrainian spheres, and who, by the way, was in the back wall, sitting behind the table at this first round of alleged peace conversations that Trump held just directly with the Russians, cutting out the Ukrainians entirely from their own fate in the very beginning. And Rybolovlev is in the room, and Rybolovlev is this fertilizer oligarch who purchased the property from Trump, more than doubling his money. But it's come out that Rybolovlev might have actually even supplied the money on the front end for Trump to purchase it, which points directly at potential, I would say, Kompromat based on something like money. It looks like a perfect example of a money laundering operation. And the final point I'll make on this is that at the time, Michael Cohen has said, Trump's previous lawyer, has said that Trump at the moment when Rybolovlev purchased this property and more than doubled his money at a crucial time, that Trump said this might be a gift from Vladimir Putin. All right. And so what you can see there is the architecture, the sublayer of obvious geopolitical potential compromat directly from the Russian sphere. Now, Rybolovlev, again, is not just some kind of random Russian-sounding guy with a lot of money. No, he's a part of the Russian deep state. He's a leading emissary of the underside from the top down of the Russian deep state. And Trump saw his intervention in a positive way in his own economic crisis at that moment as a gift from Putin. So that's Trump himself, as disclosed by Michael Cohen.
Yes, I do think that's really interesting. And thanks for fleshing out the details of the story I brought up and glossed over. We do hear a lot about Trump Epstein. We do hear a lot about Trump Russia. We don't hear a lot about Russia Israel. So help people out with that piece of the puzzle, if you can. Jeremy or Greg, whoever thinks you know it best.
Well, I wanted to follow up on what Jeremy was just saying and getting into the question of, and this will lead into the Russia-Israel factor, I think, as it relates to Epstein and Trump, et cetera, is that we've been done a tremendous disservice. And I think this is something Jeremy and I started to really notice relatively early on, probably 2017 time period, certainly going into 2018 and on, is that we have been done a tremendous disservice by a lot of what would pass for alternative media, a lot of what would pass for conspiracy culture media outlets. And let's just remember that this entire narrative around, as far as people within like alternative discourses, non-mainstream media discourses, know all things related to Trump, Epstein, how they view it, is very much shaped by people who themselves have, obviously, like, it's very much shaped by this whole network of Alex Jones and people like Roger Stone, who, of course, like Donald Trump, Roger Stone is a direct protege of Roy Cohn, who specialized in both the art of projection and in using sexual compromat in terms of and utilizing it while themselves living very, what people would say are certainly you could use the term perverted. Roger Stone likes to say libertine lifestyle, but very much our narrative around Trump being this innocent do-gooder who was trying to eradicate the world of these people who would hurt children in particular, and that any problems with the Epstein operation all surrounds this Clinton network and these deep state enemies of Trump. And not saying, of course, there's not a baby with the bathwater, but let's remember that we got the narrative that there were people saying there could be literal videos of like Clinton and others, like, doing all kinds of horrible things to children and all of this. And, but Trump is just this innocent do-gooder and all this. So I think we've been done this tremendous disservice by people who do have a vested interest in trying to portray Trump as this figure that is completely innocent of everything, while it's all onto his political enemies and opponents. And there's been an angle where I think this has been, and now we're seeing this to where I think it's created a lot of mass confusion, because there are people who have bought into these narratives, maybe not so much as like getting into like these literal like hardcore like QAnon-esque Trump is like literally trying to save the world from spiritually wicked child abusers, but some variation or another of his innocence, trying to make sense of the way Trump is treating all of this stuff around Epstein, but the way he's very clearly acting like a guilty person. And then you bring in the history of, I don't know if Trump's done anything. I mean, we've talked about this whole Katie Johnson, this Katie Doe case, among other things, but whether or not it's very clear, like, there's something very wrong with the way this man had talked about things over the years, from way he talked to Howard Stern, Jeremy, about Ivanka Trump, his then teenage daughter, and his attraction to her, or his behavior at pageants, in the locker rooms at his pageants, sometimes with Epstein either there or in the vicinity. So I want to preface just whatever we're going to say else about this whole Epstein matter with, we've been done a tremendous disservice in the way it's been covered, particularly within the types of people and narratives that have been shaping this largely, whether people know it or not. Their understanding of a lot of Trump Epstein does come out of this whole Alex Jones InfoWars adjacent network, and then that leads into QAnon and Michael Flynn types that are shaping these narratives. And I think really there needs to be a coming to grips with that, because a lot of people, I think, do not know how to respond, and there's a lot of different reactions you're seeing. But I want to make sure that that is understood. And there are both Russian and Israeli elements that very much are taking advantage of people's confusion around these matters, and also continuing to not really connect the dots together, so to speak, with the real understanding of, at the very least, even if he's not like a compromised child abuser or whatever, at the very least, there's serious problems with this guy who's been elevated into, at the very least, if you don't think he's going to like eradicate the world in some kind of secret plot to get rid of child sex abusers, at the very least, like, he's fighting some kind of good fight against deep state evildoers. And I want to really, now especially, that needs to be taken and talked about more, because it's really, there's such a tremendous disservice has been done. And I think that can catapult us into this conversation about further into Russia, Israel. But I did want to say that.
Fair
10
enough,
years going
yes.
on with this now.
I think this audience is a bit past that, but talk to us about this relationship between Israel and Russia, Netanyahu and Putin, this whole event after the Soviet Union, where it seems like a lot of Russian-speaking Jews with a lot of money, trillions of dollars apparently, washed it into Israel. And it just seems how like that was the formation of this network. Everybody talks about Project Paperclip and the Nazi apparatus coming in. Well, this seems very similar, yet I've never heard about it. Is that a fair analogy, you think?
It is fair, because there is this eruptive moment toward the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union is alleged to fall, and where then massive amounts of not only Jewish Russian refugees come streaming into Israel. And what we actually have on the background there is from a former KGB officer, Yuri Shvets, from Craig Unger's reporting in American Kompromat, in a similar kind of way that the Israeli human intelligence, Mossad, they have a very small officer corps, but then they actually have what are called Sayanim, which are people in the Jewish community around the world who are loyal to Israel and are then used as Israeli intelligence assets by this very small officer corps in human intelligence. You might say that there is a similar kind of operation that was being run out of the alleged end of the Soviet Union, where there are Soviet Sayanim, because what Yuri Shvets, this former KGB case officer, says is that 90% of Jewish refugees out of the Soviet Union, on the way out, they are basically compromised in some kind of way, where they can then be called upon down the road for some kind of help of what we might call the post-Soviet deep state or the Russian deep state in many ways. So there is that moment that's really, really crucial. And the other side of it is exactly as you said, billions to trillions of dollars washing in from the Eastern sphere into the West, but also into the Middle East. And so now we're at the moment where some of the wealthiest Israelis are Russians. People like Roman Abramovich, who operates very heavily in the UK theater too, very tied into the Trump family circles too. Abramovich basically was this key early seed funder of ethnic cleansing operations under the guise of religious archaeological tourism in the West Bank surrounding Jerusalem. And so there's a whole slew of these Russian sphere, largely Jewish, but also Israeli citizened oligarchs. And sort of tying this back into the question of Epstein, Trump, Maxwell, obviously in the background there for both Epstein and Trump to some extent. Robert Maxwell was not only Israel's super spy, he was also operating at the highest levels and at the top of the bottom half of the Russian deep state, by Maxwell having direct relationship with a former head of KGB, Kroichkov, who was Yuri Andropov's, maybe the most infamous KGB commander in Soviet history. His key mentee, Kroichkov, and Maxwell was working directly with Kroichkov, so that's the upper side of the Russian deep state. But Robert Maxwell was also working with Semyon Mogilevich, who is seen as the top of the bottom half of the Russian deep state, the global commander of the Red Mafia, of Russian organized crime. And one of the things that Robert Maxwell facilitated or gave to Mogilevich was not just Maxwell's knowledge of setting up financial instruments and front companies all around the world, as he had large experience in doing, that he taught Mogilevich. But he also it looks like he was the one who facilitated Mogilevich and some of his associates and henchmen to gain Israeli citizenship. And as we've just seen recently with another, by the way, Russian-speaking Israeli, the head of the Israeli Cyber Defense Division, Tom Davidovich, I think that's his last name, who was just apparently arrested in Las Vegas by a joint task force for allegedly attempting to procure what he thought was an underage girl via the internet, and then was sent back to Israel, but a Russian speaker. And so there's this, this well-known thing now that Israel has become not only a military garrison warfare state, but also a potential criminal outpost that criminals, whether potential pedophiles or financial criminals, or even people who truck and barter in cyber weaponry that has been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department, for example, last year, can flee to or take refuge in or stand behind the walls in order to evade the long arm of justice. And so a lot of this goes back through not only the end of the Soviet Union, but it actually goes back to the very beginning of Israel, and is very resonant with what you talked about, the potential, a Soviet parallel to Operation Paperclip, but also on a global scale. And what we've seen recently too, is that even at the origins of what we see of the Israeli state, such as the King David Hotel bombing, many people will recognize that the King David Hotel bombing might have been the crucial event, terrorist, some might call it military targeting of some sort, that targeted this key British installation. It was a key British intelligence installation at King David Hotel. And it turns out from the Matrokin archives that were brought to the UK by a Soviet archivist that the Soviet Union actually tasked probably at that point one of their highest, if not the highest mole that they had in, at the very least, in the European sphere of intelligence, Kim Philby, who was heading toward becoming the head of British intelligence before these suspicions of being a KGB mole came upon him, that the Soviets tasked Philby to do the crucial precursor counterintelligence distraction work against the British on behalf of the Zionist terrorists in order to facilitate the successful terrorist bombing of the British's King David Hotel. So this then begins to point out the architecture of a long-term generation of a strategy of tension or a weaponized geopolitical dialectics that the Soviets appear to have been involved in actually potentially helping establish the origins of what we now know as the Israel-Palestine conflict. And to this day, it appears that they have deep influence. Now, in this case, it's the Kremlin, the Russian government, has deep influence and deep relationships at the commanding heights of both the alleged Palestinian so-called leadership groups, whether it's the sort of former PLO, now known as the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, or in relationship to Hamas in Gaza, and a very direct and very deep relationship that Putin and Netanyahu have had, especially during the entirety virtually of the 21st century. They probably, of any two leaders in the world, have had the most face time together in the 21st century, if you added it up.
Really? I think that would surprise people. Is there anything about like them getting into their positions of power that suggests, like, what's the earliest point where you could say there's a major relationship or that someone within this network helped them, one or both, get into their position?
Well, that's a very good question. Now, with Netanyahu, for example, Netanyahu can be seen as the godfather of the terror war, or what we might call the war on terror proxy concept. It's a rubric of some sort that he's been developing on the highest levels of the public stage since 1979, and his gathering together of the Jerusalem Conference that began to architect throughout the 80s this whole idea that the West was facing a war on terror, an Arab primarily, but also sort of begin to hint at a Muslim terrorist problem that was not just Israel's, but was the entirety of the West. And then Netanyahu is then in 1996 actually brought into the highest levels of Israeli power for the first time to become prime minister by this crucial American Jewish Republican, closeted, by the way, godfather of dirty politics, Arthur Finkelstein. Arthur Finkelstein was the main guy behind Netanyahu becoming prime minister in 1996. Finkelstein also then becomes the key Republican operative to mainline Trump into the RNC at a time when people were very finicky, including people like Lindsey Graham, who have now become all-out alleged allies of Trump, back when Lindsey Graham was saying, if we embrace Trump, then we will we will be destroyed as a party, and it will be deservedly so. This is the time when Arthur Finkelstein is helping then mainline Trump into the RNC. Arthur Finkelstein also helped Viktor Orban in Hungary come to power on the back of these similar kinds of narrative warfares around George Soros is the globalist New World Order boogeyman, and that's the entire story. And anyone who George Soros is against is on the good side, including George Soros being against the Iraq War, really. So that's a piece of that. So there's this background in terms of Netanyahu coming to power, and Orban specifically represents this key figure that represents the European middle access point between Netanyahu's Israel and Putin's Russia. Now, then we would then have to talk about how did Vladimir Putin really ascend to power, meaning he became prime minister of Russia, but he hadn't yet fully grasped his power until the Moscow bombings of 1999. which now at this point appear to be notoriously known amongst at least the older generation in Russia and amongst a lot of Western intellectuals to have been some kind of domestic deep state Russian false flag operation run very likely by a combination of the FSB and the GRU being their military intelligence services, FSB being their more state security, domestic kind of security services. And so then, of course, 2 years later, boom goes 9/11, which is now becoming notoriously known that Netanyahu had a very similar so-called reaction to September 11th as he did to October 7th. He thought it was incredible. He thought it was very good for Israel, especially in terms of the relationship with the United States, especially in terms of the massive launching of the global war on terror. So I would say it's these 3 years, basically, 99, 2000, and 2001, that you can see the major launching of the global war on terror, which catapult people like Putin and Netanyahu into the commanding heights of global power. And the last thing I'll point out is that similarly to after September 11th in the United States, where we had an entire new, department created, Department of Homeland Security, heavily Israeli modeled, if not run, penetrated, that's now become probably one of the largest militaries in the world, especially after Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill, DHS and ICE and all of that. That's a very major domestic army that has major Israeli background to it. The same way that we got the Patriot Act, and then we launched wars, foreign wars. So Putin did the very similar kind of thing after his own 9/11, the Moscow apartment bombings in 1999. He solidified his domestic political power. He amplified the Russian police state, and then he very much escalated his second Chechen war and ultimately destroyed Grozny and all of that.
Right on.
And
yes, that's a great summary.
yeah, if I could add on to
please do.
If I could add on to that, Jeremy. Remember, after the second Chechen war, which was 99 and on, which was launched as a result of the Moscow apartment bombings, Putin, I believe it was November of 1999, publishes an op-ed in the New York Times, writes an op-ed for the New York Times, basically sounding, I told you, Jeremy, it sounds like a hybrid of Netanyahu and George W. Bush of how would you Americans feel if your buildings were blown up and set fire by, and what would you do about it? And so I think this is underrated also, that there's a very similar philosophy with regards to, I think, the Putin and Netanyahu camps when it comes to certainly waging and escalating this global war on terror, you could call it, against Islamic populations, and then also obviously being extended to their neighbors in Ukraine and in greater, and what is now known as Israel, respectively, in terms of what we've been seeing going on, obviously for decades before that, but obviously really kicked into high gear since October 7th. But, you've got Putin here in the New York Times sounding like this op-ed or this hybrid of Netanyahu and George W. Bush's most provocative terror war statements. And remember also, Jeremy, how Russia was a key allowing the opening up of the airspace to go into Afghanistan and other things. And I think the Russian role in this is rather underrated. And then also I'll mention, moving on to the 2010s, of what was it, Jeremy? I believe maybe around 24 interactions and meetings between Putin and Netanyahu between the 2013 and 2016 to 17 time period, which is when Russia steps into Syria. And there's a very common purpose here, at least I think between elements of the forces around Netanyahu and Putin, to at the very least take advantage of the situation in Syria, and then also this whole thing with Libya and bringing that in as well, and very much the push narrative that I think both the Israeli Netanyahu and Putin camps benefit from. Obama and Clinton are the mother and father of ISIS and all of this, and a big part of that, I think, comes from, we can always have a conversation to suss out what is and is not true about that, but there's clearly a vested interest by both of these camps to at the very least take advantage of this tension going on, mainly within Syria, but then also other countries in the region, and using that to both push back and counter like any type of like Western influence as far as intervention into Syria goes, and then also to exacerbate it in terms of a major event that led to the rise of Donald Trump and the installing of Trump, which was this refugee migrant crisis in the late 2015-2016 time period, and this era of heightened terrorism and all of this. So there's a very vested interest by both the Putin and Netanyahu camps to advance this in terms of geopolitically, but then also what we call, Jeremy, this hybrid of the clean break culture wars, and that's really bringing these wars to your home's front, with in terms of not just looking at the global war on terror as going over into Middle Eastern countries and destabilizing them and killing and bombing a ton of people, but also bringing the wars to Western countries directly in terms of these what you might call clash of civilizations, as some people would put it. But yeah, there is this relationship, and people sometimes can't see it for a number of reasons, but it's definitely there. And there's I think, a mutual vested interest in exacerbating these conflicts domestically and geopolitically from a Putin-centric and a Netanyahu-centric perspective.
Yeah, that is great, guys. I think that's a lot of deep history that people just aren't aware of. It never really makes it into the conversation. So this is just kind of a tangent I wanted to ask you about, but something else we saw since Jeremy and I last spoke was this weird situation, quite disturbing, this tunnel under the synagogue in New York. I'm asking you about this because you track Jewish lines of power, you track networks of child trafficking. A lot of people think this was something that should have been discussed more, and it kind of got swept under the rug. But this synagogue in New York had this tunnel underneath it. It got kind of exposed. Then there's this footage showing them pulling out an old mattress with either blood or shit on it, like some big stain, some red, brown stain right in the center. Very disturbing when you go through the logic of your mind of, well, how could that happen? And then the footage inside the tunnels, there's like a baby carrier in there. Do you guys have any insight into how that situation could connect to a larger story or anything? Did you investigate that to any significant degree?
Not to a large degree, but it is the case that there has been an escalation of rumblings from within the grassroots, let's say, of the Jewish Orthodox community about massive and pervasively covered up child abuse. It's sort of similar, it's a parallel in some ways to what we saw around the Catholic Church, where there was a lot of internal and powerful attempts to cover up what was endemic. And so this is some of the words that we're getting from the more courageous aspects of the Jewish Orthodox community. So the question of these tunnels, we don't know, never been down there, don't have any deep insight in terms of exactly what they were being used for. However, we do know that these kinds of subterranean relationships, and they can be both physical and they could also be political, they could even be spiritual in many ways. For example, what is the underground connection between the address 9 of Epstein's former property and the address 11 of Epstein's former property that then got passed on to Howard Lutnick? They were once a complex of some sort. And so, even in Los Angeles, where I'm from, it's becoming more and more known that there are these long pre-existing underground tunnels that connect large, major portions of the city. And we've always heard also about, deep underground military bases, potential massive subterranean architecture. And so there are so many pieces to this potentially, but obviously, from the Los Angeles perspective, a lot of this just comes down to deep politics, drug running, sex trafficking, mob activity. But you can imagine there's also a tie-in then to the upper side, the deep state and deep politics, and how that might emerge. And of course, New York City is a primary headquarters, obviously, of Jewish power in many ways, but also it's probably the key city in terms of political power of Israel specifically. The New York Police Department has long had a deep relationship with the Israeli security state and security services. I believe they even have had an office set up in Israel for a long time. And so the New York Police Department actually, I think, led the way on what we became to be known as the deadly exchange post September 11th, where we had Jewish power organizations such as JINSA, the Jewish Institute of National Security, formerly Affairs, now America, and the so-called Anti-Defamation League, the godchild of the Judeo-Masonic B'nai B'rith, being the leading organizations to establish a deadly exchange of American policing with Israel. So I guess I'm saying that above the tunnels, both physical and metaphorical, and the inside, below the ground, physical and metaphorical, of the tunnels are compromised by these deep state elements.
Fair enough. Yeah, I just wanted to throw that in because it was a little story that caught brief attention and really seemed like it could have turned into a Pizzagate 2.0 if people had really gotten in there. So I want to fit this into the first hour too. So Greg, you mentioned the disservice from alternative media. I kind of agree, although I have such a hard time unraveling what the actual truth is sometimes that I don't really know if a person's being intentionally deceptive, just ignorant, or, what's going on. But on The Antidote, you guys have been critical, and on Twitter, of Dave Smith, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, the list goes on. Well, some of these names are very critical of Israel. They're calling the situation in Gaza a genocide. I'm curious, I talked in the intro about Mockingbird 2.0, perhaps. What do you think's going on in alternative media? Which organizations do you see as definitely fronts for the network? And who do you think are some of the big red flags that you would advise people to probably think twice about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And indeed we have, it's very interesting, the particular names you mentioned, we could go into Candace Owens, or just other names. I think the way I view these Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson type, Steve Bannon in recent years has really gotten into this being very critical of Netanyahu and of Israeli influence over American politics and certainly over foreign policy. You've got all of these people have been, to varying degrees or another, proponents of elements of what we would call this hybrid of terror and culture war, Jeremy. And I'd say they all certainly serve as this whole thing with a culture to this day. Candace Owens goes from Daily Wire employee, Ben Shapiro employee, to this major critic. But I think the way that they go about it is it's all still being done in the way that I think figures into this bigger symmetry between these Netanyahu and Putin areas around them and certain influence and operations between them of still advancing these same narratives. I would say, let's remember, Stephen Bannon, who also has his own very serious Epstein questions when it comes to these hours of tapes that he recorded with Epstein, where he was said to be coaching and almost rehabilitating Epstein's PR image in I think they took place in the months and the year or so leading up before Epstein's death, with whatever happened there with his whatever happened there that weekend we were at the Iowa State Fair, Jeremy.
Sure.
Whatever happened there with Epstein, and he's now remember, Steve Bannon was the head of Breitbart, which is this website that was made in America, conceived in Israel. And we've always talked about this article, Jeremy, with the photo of Benjamin Netanyahu sitting at the table in Jerusalem with Andrew Breitbart and Jim Hoft of the Gateway Pundit, another very interesting figure to say the least. And I believe Larry Solov, who was Breitbart's, I think, best friend and business partner, and he's the CEO of Breitbart to this day. And that article was published with this photo on the day of the launching of the Breitbart Jerusalem branch, which was headed by Aaron Klein, who was I believe he was a WorldNet Daily, very much pushing the Obama terrorist narrative and all of this, which very much is beneficial to, I'd say, certainly out of a very Israeli, not just Israeli, but a very hard line, pro-settlement, get rid of the Palestinians by whatever way we have to in order to make way for what we want, network of people. And I see these people, and you can throw Tucker Carlson in here too. Remember, some of us still remember when Tucker Carlson was an apologist for the Iraq War on CNN, and maybe this is an example of a broken clock being right twice a day, but Jon Stewart calling him out on his acquiescence to the Bush administration all the way back in 2003, 2004. And now, you've had all of these rebrandings. And it's not to say people can have legitimate, genuine rebrandings, but I would say that all of these people are still, and Jeremy, you can follow up on this if you want, advancing these. Any criticism of what we're seeing going on now in terms of Israeli influence and all this, it's always in this same, I think, what makes up this whole dynamic of this mutual joint benefiting from these pushing of this, what we call the clean break terror culture wars, and how they're being utilized domestically and internationally. So that's part of where I come from with criticism of those types of figures. And they are bringing legitimate things to the plate. That's also certainly correct too. But I have bigger issues with like the way that they're going about it, to say the least. I'm sure Jeremy does too, and he can talk about that.
Yeah, I would just like to start by saying that it's very important to understand the conceptual framework here. People have a tendency to understand what reverse psychology might be, but we have a tendency to fall into dialectics very readily. But this is another area, conceptually, intellectually, where the Russian and the Israeli sphere, and especially the information warfare, narrative warfare spheres, are very much not only parallel, but related. And that going back to the origins of the political Zionists, Herzl himself in his diaries, talking about how the anti-Semites will be our best friends. And this was literal, because what we saw was that the political Zionists needed to drive Jews wherever they were, whether they were from Shoah sphere in Europe during World War II. We even have now records of FDR's Jewish deputy going to American Jewish Zionist alleged community leaders, saying FDR has a plan to save up to around 1 million of European Jews to not only the United States, but allied countries, and then being called a traitor to his face by these alleged American Jewish Zionist leaders, because they were that would take the Jews from Europe off the table from their actual project to push them into Palestine for their ethnic cleansing project and all of that. And so we saw, even after Israel was created, that Israeli intelligence orchestrated what we might now see as just anti-Semitic terrorism, is the way it would be called, especially in the Mizrahi Jewish world, especially in Iraq, in North Africa, throughout the Middle East. We saw targeted terrorism by the Jewish state intelligence forces against Jewish communities, directly creating a sense of anti-Semitic terror in order to drive Jews to their project in Palestine. So we see this has become very obvious to anybody who's done any research about the background of political Zionism, that at the same time as you have the alleged king of the Jews, Netanyahu, proclaiming to be the greatest defender of Jews worldwide, he represents an actual deep political network that also was very likely involved in the death and destruction of Jews in their own local and regional communities, including, I would say, on up through things like September 11th, which was done at the epicenter of the American Jewish homelands to some extent, in terms of Lower Manhattan and close to Brooklyn and all of that. And a few hundred Jews were killed on September 11th. And then Netanyahu basically danced on their graves the next day in the New York Times by calling it basically very good, or at least it will generate immediate sympathy and all of that, while then using it as a way to browbeat the American Congress and generate a hindbrain fear toward his clean break wars led by the United States in the Middle East. But the same kind of dialectic, weaponized dialectic, exists in the previous Soviet and Russian sphere, where you have what you might call the pro-Semitic and the anti-Semitic almost always in total parallel. And it goes on, even Putin himself. Remember this infamous moment after the 2016 American elections, where he basically said if Russia was involved, it was sort of echoing what Trump had said. This could be anybody who was hacking in the United States or doing influence operations on our elections. It could be a guy in his basement or something like that. And Putin said, these might not even be ethnic Russians, is what he was saying. These could be Jews or something like that. And a lot has been made in the so-called alternative media to prop up Putin as some kind of anti-New World Order leader of the axis of resistance or something like that, by talking about the way that he basically disciplined, imprisoned, expelled a handful of Jewish Russian oligarchs. Okay, that is the case. But meanwhile, and after that, he basically just disciplined the Russian deep state and facilitated the usage of many other Russian Jewish oligarchs to serve the larger Russian deep state. And then in terms of Jewish community life, Putin has made a direct relationship and has helped catalyze, I would call, the most, reactionary of organized political Judaism, which would be the Chabad-Lubavitch movement. And so now, whereas Russian Jewish life was a little bit more diverse in certain ways, in a similar kind of way that American Jewish life is fairly diverse in terms of the different kinds of Judaism that different American Jews may be associated with or practice. Russia was sort of similarly diverse in a certain way. And now we're at the point of where Chabad Lubavitch is almost the totality of Jewish life in Russia. And Putin has a very close relationship with these Jewish alleged leaders. We have, of course, his was called Putin's rabbi, Berel Lazar, who is very deeply involved, especially in terms of this axis that you opened this show up about, in terms of the Tel Aviv, Moscow, New York axis. That's the conceptual architecture that I think we have to keep in mind, is that the Russian sphere and the Israeli sphere both have a long-term history and architecture of using both sides of the so-called pro-Semitism, anti-Semitism dialectic for their own deep geopolitical ends. And so that's a lot of what we see with certain people such as Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens, maybe specifically. They're very, very Russian sphere. And so as they turn from the commanding heights of the Zionist media power in many ways and begin to turn publicly against Israel, watch especially in terms of how that is related to their obscuring of the facts around the multipolar world order or the Russian sphere, and how those almost are inverted in a certain way. And then you can begin to sort of pick up on the deeper geopolitics of why you might have people beginning to come out and heavily criticize, in often very legitimate ways, the Israeli massacre of Palestinians, the Israeli domination of American geopolitics, and all of that, but doing it in a way that also seems to serve Russian multipolar world order, deep geopolitical interests in a larger informational structure.
And one real quick follow-up, I think a person that could be seen as maybe instructive, Jeremy, and you would agree with me on this, I think, would be the figure of Jackson Hinkle. Jackson Hinkle is somebody that, he's self-described MAGA communist. I think that's how he describes himself. And interesting, like, he was really boosted and propped up on the post-Elon Twitter, now X algorithms, post-October 7th, as like this leading critic of Netanyahu and Israel. You'd see him everywhere. But before October 7th, he was talking about how, like, Netanyahu is good for the multipolar world order and all of this. So I think that's an instructive one, would be the figure of a Jackson Hinkle. I haven't kept up with him in a little bit, but I know like what he was doing in the aftermath of October 7th and how it in some ways kind of differed from his attitude toward things before that, when he was boosted big time by these, social media, and he really took off in terms of being like a quote unquote thought leader in terms of, hey, I'm the guy on the front lines of criticizing the Zionist project and what it's doing.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it seems like they throw people out there, they light a fire, they see if it catches, and if it doesn't, they're like, all right, you're out. You didn't catch fire. We gave you every opportunity. We put you in front of all the screens, and you didn't click. So maybe he's one of those guys. But yeah, they're always throwing new people at us and trying to compromise us and trying to find that sweet spot where we actually trust again. And they're good at exploiting it, no doubt. So to go back to the idea of this shadow network, I mean, you're pretty good at mapping out connections people don't really think about or know about very often. This whole idea of like bringing the Jews back to Israel, I guess I'm just curious. I want to know the history and all that stuff because I really just want to understand the goals and motivations. Like it always kind of depends on, in the conspiracy world, who you put at that apex of the pyramid. Different people put a different group there, Freemasons, all kinds of different groups. And then you can reverse engineer, well, what would they be motivated by? But I guess I would ask you guys, what do you think the primary goal of the big, if there's a hierarchy, the highest level of this network, what really motivates them? Is it just a power quest? Is it something deeper, like some kind of weird religious motivation or a genetic motivation or something philosophical? Is it just power for power's sake? Help me out here in terms of like, why even do this? Why move people around on the board? What do you really care?
Oh, go if you have a thought, Jeremy. But I was just I was thinking real quick about this. I could bring a little bit. I'll make it quick because I know we've got a time here. A little bit of a, I guess, a secular Protestant perspective on some of this that I might come from, and just thinking about, this won't answer the question, but it might give a little bit of insight. I look to the 1970s and like the formation of the new right and the religious right amongst like this kind of coming together of American Protestants and Catholics, kind of motivated by a number of things, post Jim Crow era, post civil rights era. And there's these two seminal figures that I think line up both like evangelical Christian Zionism and then more of your more maybe Russia friendly culture war type of conservative Christianity, and the figures of Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell. And they come together to pretty much form this moral majority, which is this probably the key conservative Christian organization of the 1980s, really responsible for, Jeremy, I think, a major part of what we call the first spiritual compromise of the American evangelical, going for Ronald Reagan, the Hollywood actor, over Jimmy Carter, whatever you want to say about him, this ordained minister and Sunday school teacher. And there's this agreement here where, you bring in the social issues. I think the Protestants really get on board with abortion as this key cultural issue and key societal issue that mainly was a Catholic issue before that. But I think this kind of brings in both the philo-Semitic and what you'd call anti-Semitic side of this, because I think with this Catholic side of things, there's this big time, what you call traditional Catholic elements, this the pre-Vatican II, and what they see as the destruction of the church through all this modernism, in some ways, Jewish dictated modernism of the church. And then from the Protestant side, you have both this clamoring for Israel, like in this hardcore apocalyptic vision of Israel in the end times, but then also this idea of this very idea that if you're a Jew and you don't accept Christ just like the rest, you're condemned. So I see this as both advances this narrative of Israel as the state of the Jewish people, but then also this very much, I think, that fits into this other side of this coin of, well, if you don't accept the way, if you don't accept this, then you are condemned to hell. So I think these things have to be taken into consideration. There's a history here in terms that could also figure into some of this perspectives and answering of questions about the Holy Land and then even the dynamics of power structure. We'd have to talk about it more another time, but this is there's an important perspective here from, I think, the modern Christian right to look at as well.
Definitely. And just to attempt to answer your question as best I can, Greg, I would say that there is something long-term here in terms of the intent of something that may be even beyond an individual human being or even power architecture that seems to be pushing itself into existence via these, as you point out, pieces on the board of geopolitics and our present moment and all that. And so just in bringing us back to the way that you started us, in terms of the current rise in the United States of the sort of technate administration, the North American tech bro potential, looking at the idea of replacing the American potential constitutional republic, democracy system with some kind of neo-feudal techno-monarchy of some sort. That I think that it's in this realm that we can see the larger logics that exist beyond even deep geopolitics. And so I'll finish up by saying that look at the 20th century. The the 20th century represented the rise of WMD, weapons of mass destruction, in a large way, whether nuclear, biological, chemical. And somewhat legitimately, there then is alleged to be a response or a reaction by state power centers around the world in terms of security state architectures. And so now in the 21st century, it's obvious that we're in the motions of the engagement of artificial intelligence. It's now been publicly put to use in terms of specific alleged targeting in Gaza, where bulk data collection by Israeli military intelligence Unit 8200 put on Microsoft servers in Europe are then used to potentially bulk collect and then target entire families for partially AI decided targeting. So I think the kill chain being potentially disrupted or transcended from its human origins is potentially the deeper dynamic and the logics of power that we need to really watch out for right now as we get further into this 21st century.
Well said. And it is complicated. Maybe we do have time to throw in one last thing, because I can already get in front of the comments that I see in my head that are, we didn't even mention Iran. We didn't even mention China. And I know you guys did a series where you read from a book about the Israeli-Chinese relationship and the New Silk Road. Can we just fold that in really quickly? What do you think is going on there? Is Russia playing both sides of this alliance and that alliance? Or I think a lot of Americans are just really ignorant of the Israel-China relationship too, and what's really going on there.
Definitely. And this is why, I like to talk about the new multipolar world order, which It looks like is being proposed in terms of maybe these three frontal figures of Trump, Netanyahu, and Putin. But China is immediately right in the background there. And what it looks like is that there is a proposal for a new world order that in some ways is a return to a regionalized sort of fiefdom system of some sort, where the United States is put back in its hemispheric box of some sort and includes a highly stratified economic society that is sort of blatantly in oligarchy or plutocracy or techno elite driven society. And then Russia and China and the Eastern fold are become the major deep geopolitical architects from there on downwards, through the so-called third world, through South Central Asia, through India and all that. And as you pointed out, the new Silicon Road or the Belt Road Initiative or Belt Road has become this major player in terms of the region. And so I'll just point out that China plays these same kind of weaponized dialectic games where they, have pushed very hardcore anti-Zionist kind of perspectives via social media, allowed it, let's say, on TikTok and all of that. And it's just now begun to come out amongst the foreign policy elite of, while China will publicly criticize the Israel and Israeli actions in Gaza to some extent, they're only deepening their actual real economic and political relationship with Israel in terms of infrastructure and all of that. And it does appear that, for example, with the attacks on Iran, but where Trump sent American B-2 bombers to bomb Iranian nuclear sites, that there was this whole emphasis by the so-called axis of resistance people or the new JQ people, especially post-October 7th people on the internet, that Iran was going to be backed by Russia as a countervailant force against the Zio-American imperial West or something like that. And I was telling them, I was like, that's not really what's going to happen. Iran specifically asked Putin's Russia for help. They appeared to have not gotten a return phone call of an answer on that. And then Putin was asked about it afterwards. And he's like, well, what do you want me to do? Like, Israel is a Russian country. We have millions of our people there. There's millions of Russian speakers there in many ways. So it does look, in a certain way, actually, China has been handed the Iran file to some extent, and Russia will be backing away a little bit. And my final point will be for people to actually look at the deep background of Iran and the United States by looking into the actual real hostage crisis, how the Khomeini was not just sort of an organic push. He was actually, he was installed by certain American cowboy CIA elements. And so we see a strange repetition of the October so-called surprise from Carter into Reagan Bush, as we actually see in terms of Biden into Trump, in terms of Netanyahu making sure that certain hostage deals that were being ready to be made by almost all sides except for himself were not made until his boy Trump was reinstalled in the White House.
Oh, great point. Yeah, I definitely see the parallel there. I'm
One
glad I asked.
real quick data point on this whole thing of China and this relationship is, Jeremy, you'll remember this years ago. New England Patriots owner Robert Kraft was busted at this massage parlor / day spa in South Florida, I think within what, 100-mile proximity of Mar-a-Lago. And turns out that this woman was owned by this Chinese national, and there were all kinds of pictures of many different MAGA world people that were taken with this owner of this place, that this very, very partisan Zionist power, very influential figure, Robert Kraft, partaking in. And there is this question. There's some of these people, there's key relationships I think that need to be evaluated. Like Steve Bannon, who's kind of in some ways like the thought leader of like the anti-establishment, quote unquote, side of MAGA and all this, has this extensive relationship with this Chinese billionaire, Guo Wengui. And then also this relationship with, I think you get the sense, you look at, maybe there's a bit of a managing of like the opposition to the CCP as far as the propping up of the Falun Gong by some of these networks. And then also, Jeremy, who is the guy who's helping to put in place some of the infrastructure for the surveillance side of domestic Chinese operations as far as the Uyghur population goes? It's Eric Prince, a power broker, as far as his family and his familial connections to this Christian, organized elements of Christian Zionism and apocalyptic Christian Zionism. Eric Prince has been helping to spearhead this whole elements of the Belt Road Initiative, and then also the domestic infrastructure as far as the crackdowns on domestically in China goes. So I think those are important. And then one more thing is the history of the Los Alamos laboratory. You go back to the 90s, and figures such as the Epstein-connected energy secretary under Bill Clinton, Bill Richardson, and events that went on there in the 90s leading up into 9/11. That was part of, obviously, what was covered in the book Seeds of Fire, which is what we analyzed that you mentioned, Greg. And so those are, I think, data points to take into consideration.
Yeah, the rabbit hole does go deep, and there's many, many layers to it. And I think I'm left with even more questions than I started with today, but that's the nature of what we do around here. So thank you so much for your time, guys. I got to give Jeremy some props, because if people go and watch that video on Brennan O'Connell's channel titled A Few Good Jews, the on-screen title of this documentary seems to be Kill Switch: How Israel Rules. But Jeremy actually goes hard at so many political figures, actually like catching them out on the streets or in the halls of Congress. He put a microphone in the face of Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, and Tulsi Gabbard, all to ask them about this Jedi contract where Israeli intelligence was going to get control of the Pentagon's cloud security, and they all had nothing to say. I think Tulsi actually ran from him, so brave woman. But also, I didn't realize this first interview we did, when I looked at your IMDb page, Jeremy, you were in the classic geoengineering film, What in the World Are They Spraying?, doing the same sort of questioning. It's actually a key part of the final act of that film, so major props there. But this has been really eye-opening, guys. When I look at your online footprint, it is all over the place, and it is also has years with no content, even though you know this stuff really well. So I just think your online presence and your depth of knowledge isn't a great match for each other. But tell people where they can actually follow you in a reliable format, in an ongoing sense, and give them your links. And I mean, you're filmmakers, but I only see a couple of scattered films. So tell people where to get the goods before I let you go.
For sure. Well, first we've got to shout out John Swin at exposetheenemy.com. He was, alongside us in terms of a lot of this research, has done deep research in really crucial areas. And then ever since our YouTube channel has been taken down, he's helped platform us in terms of his website and his YouTube channel. Now, it turns out that our Antidote YouTube channel that was taken down in the run-up to the 20th anniversary of September 11th, I believe, in 2021, has actually been reinstated, it looks like. So people can actually go to the Antidote YouTube channel, which is sort of sat behind in a black box for virtually the last half decade almost. So you can join us there. You can follow us on Twitter X. I'm Jeremy WRK there, and definitely you can find us at our the Antidote Patreon link. But as you point out, Greg, we are all over the place, and so maybe over the next year or so, we could begin to make more coherent meaning connected between the depth of our research and the substantial nature of our thinking, I think, over the years, and connect it with the nature of our consistency and our presence and our coherence online. But thank you so much for having us. Yeah.
Of course. I'm glad you got the YouTube channel back. It's a shame that the ADL wasn't there to defend you and get that back when you were so cruelly deplatformed by YouTube.
As a persecuted Jew, yeah.
But yes, this is great. Thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day and keep fighting the good fight.